is by Johannes Jaeger on everything flows towards a processual perspective on life.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn and Thomas, for the invitation. This is very unexpected for me. I've never spoken in front of an audience like this. I'm a biologist, which is slightly unusual at this meeting, I think. But we're talking about the biophilic universe. So I'm going to switch focus from the conditions that are conducive to life to what life actually is, because that's a very, I know you are working, most of you, on very difficult questions like how did the universe begin, but I think what is life and how did it originate is almost as difficult a question as that. I'm going to give you a very specific sort of explanation in terms of organization and process-based arguments about organisms that go back to Heraclitus, who said very famously that everything flows, and he also thought that fire, the flame, is a sort of a good symbol for how the world works, and I think that's still, among the pre-Socratic philosophers at least, one of the better metaphors that they produce. So we're going to go into that sort of realm. Here you see a wonderful cartoon by Sidney Harris from Physics Today in 1988. There's a physicist, he's doing hard science, so he's a man, obviously there's some sexism pointed out here. He's talking to what I presume to be a social scientist or a biologist, who's obviously a woman doing soft science, saying, I'll be working on the largest and smallest objects in the universe, superclusters and neutrinos, that sounds cool. I'd like you to handle everything in between. So that's kind of a side note. I would like, so my only and main aim in the next 15 to 20 minutes is to convince you that there is quite a bit of in between here that is worth paying attention to, maybe. So the central question that I would like to address is, if you look for life, we had a very nice discussion just before of what are the criteria to look for. And it's really hard to answer this question, okay? Because you can imagine, at least, that there's life that's not based on carbon and water. So let me begin by just showing you a few examples. Some beautiful creatures here, from bacteria, this is a sea slug, fungi, plants, some mammals here. Pay attention to this diversity of this single insect family. These are tree hoppers, these creatures. And they're absolutely amazing. They're some of my favorite animals. Here's an ant mimic. So this is actually the front part of the animal. This is the back part, and the bird is exactly supposed to be confused about that. I don't know what this bug is pretending to be, but it's quite spectacular. When I call them bugs, they're actually true bugs, so that's a technical term in this case. These are thorn bugs. These are not thorns, they're actual insects here, and they're all very closely related. So there's a huge diversity in terms of the physico-chemical implementation of life, but they must share something in common. You could say, well, they all have genes, right? They have DNA. But we can imagine, again, life that works without DNA. And also, there's a problem to get from the genes to these sort of forms, okay? It is very unclear how you get from a genome to a phenotype of an animal. So we're going to take a different sort of approach. So I want to summarize this very briefly. So the principles common to all living systems are not found in their physico-chemical composition. If you boil them down, they all are these 6 elements that you saw in the talks before. Okay. Instead, I would claim, and I'm trying to convince you during this talk, living systems exhibit a peculiar and unique organization. So the way by which their constituent processes interact, and that makes them special. Okay. So, what do I mean by that? The first person to point out that living explicitly that living beings are different this way was probably Immanuel Kant, and he says in his very clear style of writing, each part of an organism owes its presence to the agency of all remaining parts, and in turn exists for the sake of the whole. Each part is reciprocally both end and means. That's actually exceptionally clear for Kant's writing. But, so you see what he's trying to say. He's trying to say there's a weird kind of sort of thing, and that is that everything that is in an organism is sort of caused by something else that is within the organism. And that is a very deep insight, I think. This thought lingered on, was carried on by different sort of people, mainly German biologists through the centuries, and suffered also in the 20th century from neglect, just like Georges Lemaitre did. And one of the philosophers that picked it up was Johannes Jaeger. And he pointed out something interesting. If all the causes of an organism, if a living system, if you accept Kant's views, if all the causes of the parts of an organism are themselves parts of the organism, then you get a weird sort of teleology, okay? So basically you cannot distinguish anymore the goal of the organism and its existence. Its existence becomes its goal. And this is a problem because in biology you cannot avoid teleological language. It's been tried to, several people have tried to explain it away. Ernst Mayr famously renamed it teleonomy, which is just teleology, but in an evolutionary biology context, you can actually show logically it's the same thing, and so on and so forth. So it's an awkward sort of thing, but maybe it is just that living beings have a purpose, and that is to continue existing. Yeah? So purpose, I use that very carefully here, doesn't imply any kind of higher power or anything, okay? So the other thing that's really interesting, how is this implemented? One factor that needed to come in here is of course living beings, they exist very far from thermodynamic equilibrium, and only like this can they implement this sort of intrinsic teleology, this structure, okay? And Johannes called this the thermodynamic predicament. Organisms do not break the second law of thermodynamics, they thrive because of it. They create internal order by making a mess around them, and we all live together, and we know that this is a fact of life. Okay? But the second you stop making a mess, you die. Okay, so that's the predicament. You have to work very hard to stay far from equilibrium, but that gives you a certain degree of freedom that other physical systems don't have. This line of thought was further developed by several biologists and philosophers in the latter part of the 20th century. In the 70s, Maturana and Varela proposed this term of autopoiesis. So living systems, this is self-production, self-maintenance. Okay, so living systems are systems that maintain themselves. The problem with this is it's very vague. It's written in philosopher's language. So Robert Rosen famously, in his book Life Itself, tried to put that into mathematical terms, and he actually used category theory to do this. Now, this is very good because it's formulated in mathematical terms. It's also very bad because no biologist can understand it. Probably there's some people in the room here that can, but I can only give you a very superficial summary of this book. His central result is summarized in this beautiful diagram, and it is, as you can immediately recognize, a diagram of an organism. Okay? Basically, what you have are three processes that make an organism. One he calls metabolism. So you have a set of chemicals A that are transformed, mapped into another set of chemicals B. This is metabolism, and metabolism, I'm not going to use his original terms because they're going to be confusing. I'm just going to give you a vague approximation in modern language. These reactions, metabolism, are implemented by a function. You can imagine these to be the enzymes of a cell that enable this reaction to happen. So this white arrow here is material cause, he calls it. So this is, these substances are transferring into these substances, but what the enzymes do is what he calls efficient causation. They are not themselves transformed, but they implement this mapping. Okay? Then you have a second mapping. What you need to do to continue your own existence is you need to replenish your set of enzymes to be able to continue. So basically, you can imagine here you have amino acids that compose the proteins that are the enzymes of the cell. So there's another material mapping here from B to F. And this is implemented by this function, phi, which is he calls repair function. So you can think of this as gene expression. So genes are regulated and they make more enzymes. Now, and here comes the trick, there is another function that he calls replication, because you need to maintain this. If this is not maintained either, you cannot go on living, you see? So there's these enzymes, you can think about enzymes that produce the machinery for gene expression. They produce this sort of system here. And that is caused by another efficient causation. So the point of this diagram is that each of these systems is caused by something else. Okay? And it's a very peculiar structure. Rosen drew two conclusions from this. He basically said this is a mathematical formulation of this sort of vague concept, and he also claimed that you cannot implement or study such a system with the sort of mathematical tools that we have nowadays. I am completely, this is very controversial, and I'm completely unable to judge that claim. It's interesting though. So from this very abstract theory, I would like to be, come back a bit to a bit more concrete ideas. Tibor Ganti was a Hungarian theoretician. He created a very specific model of such a system that is close to efficient causation. The chemoton is a chemical automaton. It has a metabolic cycle. It has some sort of machinery for the replication of that cycle. And Ganti introduces another important factor that Rosen neglected. These systems also produce a boundary, because if you don't have a boundary, you can't have a biological individual, you can't have any closure without a boundary. Okay, these systems are open, energy-wise, material-wise, open thermodynamical systems, far from equilibrium, but they have a sort of closure that affects what Rosen is calling efficient causation, which is similar but not quite equal to Aristotle's efficient causation. Okay, I hope you're still with me on this. So this is a very specific model that you can simulate and all that, but this idea has been developed in the last few years by Alvaro Moreno and Matteo Mosio and other people into a theory of what they call organizational closure. And they define a living being basically as some sort of metabolic system that creates the boundary conditions that allow the conditions, that enable the conditions for its further existence. Okay, yes?
Is this only one organism, or could it be a collection of organisms? Like replication can be outsourced to a member.
I'm going to say something very superficial afterwards, and if you're interested, I'm willing to discuss this for hours, especially over beers today. But there are a few interesting cases. I'm going to come back to this in a second. Okay, to just kind of summarize what I just said. So, the composition of a living system into its lowest level physical components is not enough to understand life. Life is not in these sort of chemicals that you have in the organism. But you need to understand the structure of the system, and you need to distinguish which of the components actually functionally contribute. And by this I mean they contribute to the self-maintenance and which don't. So for example, water serves as a solvent but is not directly involved in self-maintenance. So you do not have to consider the solvent, the water, as a part of the system. This has a very big implication. This sort of structure can be implemented at different levels. Okay, so it doesn't have to be implemented at the lowest level of chemicals only. It is, for example, implemented at the cellular level, okay, but also at the multicellular organism level. And to come back to your question, it could be, but we're not sure, communities and societies are often called superorganisms, and there's a big discussion of whether they, there's an argument to be made that they do, in some sense, correspond to this sort of causal structure. And of course, some people have made the claim that the entire biosphere exhibits these sort of characteristics. I'm not going to go into this. So another way to depict these level of organizations, so this is very important. So these causal structures that characterize living systems can be implemented at different levels. So we're going away from the kind of fundamental level of the universe to study these phenomena. This is a beautiful graph by my favorite philosopher of biology, Bill Wimsatt. And it's a complicated universe, it's a complicated graph. So what he depicts here are scales. Okay, you see, we go from the very small to the very large, and or medium size. I should take care of it if I say very large here in front of cosmologists. Very small on your scale, but from that, you know what I mean. So what the y-axis here depicts is regularity and predictability. So he says there are certain levels at which this sort of causal structure that I just told you can be identified, and is if you model a phenomena at that level, it's very predictable. Okay, so there's some sort of levels that just work for explanations of the universe. There are atoms here. There's a molecular level, macromolecules, proteins, DNA, cells, small organisms, bigger organisms. The ants go all the way up here to socio-cultural systems. Okay, so it's very... Now, you could think of different structures of these levels. Okay, so if you accept this sort of view that challenges eliminative reductionism, then you could have different sort of ways in which these levels are actually characterized in the universe. You could have a random distribution. That would probably indicate not something about the universe, but that you chose the wrong choice of variables, just like Lemaitre found out with the sitter, right? If things really don't make sense, there's probably something wrong with your theory and not with the universe. We could be really unlucky, and then the universe would look like this, and that would be really bad for science. Okay? But the most plausible sort of scenarios are in the middle. This is a funny universe where you have very ill-defined levels at the bottom, and they become clearer and clearer and more clearly separated. This is a universe that favors sort of vitalism, but Wimsatt thinks, and I agree, that we live in something like this. So you, most of you are lucky because you work at levels that are you can very clearly separate the sort of levels at which you should study your phenomena, at which you should model. But the further up you get, the unclearer it gets. So organisms have a much larger size distribution than neutrons and protons, things like that. Okay, they are also they cross different scales. So you have bacteria in your gut, and these are important for your continued existence. So are they part of your organism or not? They're very difficult questions. So our world looks a bit more like this. So why can we talk about things actually existing at these levels at all? Wimsatt introduces a very interesting notion which he calls robustness. He says the entities that you can detect, infer, observe, those are the entities that exist. So for example, if you look around the room, he says organisms are real because we have very different ways in which to identify organisms. Okay, so we should treat them as a real thing that needs to be studied. Okay, so he develops this sort of local realism. Something is real if you have many independent ways in which to detect it, or infer it, that's okay, or observe it. And so he builds this into a sort of perspectivism. He says, this is a realist philosophy. He says there is a sort of a structure to the universe, but we cannot ever see the whole thing. We're always bound to our own perspective, so we can only have a more or less local model. So the models they use in physics are obviously very broad. They're still modeled local in some ways because they don't describe everything. Even if you had a theory of everything, it wouldn't really describe everything. Like life, for example. I'm saying this deliberately provocatively here. Okay? While in biology, the applicability of our models is a lot more narrow, I can tell you. Okay? So if there's some generalities, it's much harder to find them and generalize from that. Okay, so this brings me to a point that is very important from a biologist's perspective. Often we are at danger. So what Wimsatt is really arguing here is that we should not mistake our model of the world for the world. And this brings me to a very famous quote by Alfred North Whitehead. He calls this sort of thing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's the error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. Wimsatt, with his philosophy of robustness and robustly detectable entities, is trying to avoid this. Now, how is this relevant for anything that has anything to do with biological research? I think it's fundamental. Basically, there is one big problem with biology, and that has to do with this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It has to do with the idea that what the explanations we want for biology are in terms of things instead of processes. Okay? So I would claim entities that are stable, things are abstractions, and they're also just slow processes, basically. Okay? So you can consider everything a process, especially in biology. To illustrate this, there's a beautiful paper by the German philosopher Johannes Jaeger. It's called The Myth of Substance and the Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness. So she binds this very clearly to Whitehead. The myth of substance means that whenever you try to come up with the mechanism of something, the mechanism is maybe based on some entities that do something. Okay? And I want to convince you now that you can do away with the entities, but you can't do away with the do something. Organisms are basically what they do. Okay, so a beautiful example of this is a subjectless activity. It is snowing. Okay, there's nobody snowing here. Although there are snowflakes, There may be entities, but none of these snowflakes are snowing. They're snowing together, okay? And they're a process, they're subjectless. They're happening, and it can snow here and there at the same time. So it's hard to delimit the boundaries of this process. We need a bit more specific ideas in biology to understand what life is and to place this sort of relational, organizational account of life in its proper context. So I think a very central notion in life is the notion of a living organism is a life cycle. Okay, so that's a process. It comes back to Hume's idea of, he was trying to look for the self inside his head. He was really puzzled because the thoughts he had now were different from the thoughts he had 2 minutes ago, and he concluded there is no self. Of course, he could have also concluded the self is not a thing, it's a process. You are not who you were before, but you are in a very strange way. In the same way that a fly remains a fly throughout its life cycle. But look at the fly. The fly lays eggs. I study flies, or used to study flies in the lab, I should say. That's why I'm using it here. But it's also a beautiful example of something that hatches, looks like a worm. So 3 maggot stages, they molt, and then they metamorphose and become this adult creature. This is very interesting because 90% of the tissues in the adult are completely new. They are completely reformed during the pupa, including a lot of the brain. So we have no idea if the fly knows that it was a maggot at any point in time. It's an interesting question. So this adult organism has very little to do with this. It has a different ecology, different lifestyle, different brain, different tissues. So how is a fly still a fly? And I think that has something to do with a different criterion of identity. You can't identify a fly by its composition. You need a process explanation, and the process explanation here is a concept that the German physicist Kurt Lewin came out in the 1920s. It's called gen identity. It's a concept of identity that's based on causal continuity. Okay, this is a fly because it's always been a fly throughout its life, and its ancestors were flies, and it's in a local sort of environment. This is you don't give birth to a crocodile, but you do evolve, of course. Okay, so this is an idea that stresses a causal identity, causal continuity as an identity criterion. So what we want to do in biology is really we want to understand how these life cycles evolve. So I'm showing you here 2 processes of the same dynamic. Ontogenesis means the way you develop from egg to adult. That's the life cycle here. And then phylogenesis is how different sorts of organisms change in their frequency in populations, and this is how evolution happens. So if we do evolutionary biology, we usually only look at this sort of superficial level here. But what we really need to do is we need to come up with a model that shows how this sort of causally closed, organizationally closed structure of a living being leads to a closed, more or less, life cycle that is able to evolve. That's the central challenge. And this is an incredibly complicated problem. So we've made a lot of progress lately the last decades in these kind of abstract domains that I was showing you before. So I think we have a lot better idea, a more concrete idea of what we have to look for if we want to define life. And then we have techniques that allow you to study processes that make up the life cycle, but there we have to zoom in at a little bit of a window here, and I'll just give you, to finish in 2 slides, one example of what we actually did in the lab and what these sort of explanations look like. It's a bit disappointing because we can only explain a small part of the organism for a small developmental period at this point, but if you want to climb a mountain, you have to take a first step, right? So this is kind of the first step towards this. Every geneticist's favorite animal is it's not a fruit fly, it's a vinegar fly. Fruit flies eat fruit. This fly eats yeast that grows on rotting fruit. It's not a parasite. It has a beautiful segmented body pattern. You see these stripes here, the pairs of legs. So it has a modular, basically, pattern that's made of these body segments. That is important for 2 reasons. First of all, it's important for the development of the fly, and it's also important for the evolution, because segmented animals are incredibly successful during evolution, because you can play around with the structures on the different segments. I'm using very anthropomorphic language here, just for the sake of brevity, okay? So it is really important to understand how this works. Now, what I'm showing you next is a fly embryo. This is the head end, this is the tail end, and what you see, these dots are the nuclei of the embryo. What you see here is a protein that is expressed by a gene that is involved in this process. And wherever there's red, the protein is present, and wherever it's black, it's not. And you can see how this pattern evolves from a sort of a blobby, polarized, but very crude pattern into this beautiful stripy pattern. And this is a pre-pattern for the segmental body plan. I also want to pay you to pay attention that some of the stripes move around. Some of them stay put. So we've spent 15 years developing the methods, quantifying the data, and then modeling the system with a dynamical systems approach to find out that it's a really simple sort of network, gene network that creates this pattern. So what you see here are 3 genes. They produce proteins and they inhibit each other in this way. This is a really nice little network. It's called the Acdc network because it, not because of the heavy metal band, but that's cool too, but it can do switches and oscillations. It's the simplest network that implements a positive and a negative feedback loop at the same time. So you can have switches, you can have relaxation oscillations, so throwing the switch back and forth, you can have damped oscillations, or if you push the system, you can have oscillations. Here you see a mouse embryo, that's not a fly anymore, that's a mouse embryo in a dish, and you can see these beautiful pulses of gene expression during its segmentation process. So the gene is switched on and off during the development of this fly. And you can relate that to these features that you saw before. It sets static boundaries, switches, shifting the main boundaries, damped oscillations are then these kind of adding one segment by one. Through sequential segmentation, you can explore the phase space of this system. And this is what I mean by sort of process-based explanations. So we have to build up in biology. You can never do the top-down sort of things, deduce things from theory. It's never gone well in the past, even though Darwinian evolution has had some success. But you still have to look at the individual examples and see what's actually happening, and you can maybe then get to some generalities. So this is the approach. We're trying to do this for many different systems and try at the end to get at a model of the entire life cycle of the entire organism. But I'm not quite sure I will still live to see that. Take-home messages very briefly. Living systems are purely physicochemical in their composition. I am not a vitalist, okay? So living systems do not break any laws of physics at all, okay? But they cannot be explained by reduction to physics or chemistry alone because they implement this special causal structure. And this sort of view is called organicism. And implicitly all biologists have it, but they often have a hard time explaining it. Okay, we think biology should be a discipline after all. To understand life, we need a multi-level perspective on the complex interacting causal processes that constitute the peculiar organization of living systems. That's what makes them different from the rest. That is basically it. I am, since a year, the director of a little advanced study institute that is trying to, just outside Vienna, that is trying to bring together philosophers and biologists to do theoretical biology. That's a thing. It's very much less prominent than theoretical physics, but apart from evolutionary theory, there are people who work on cognition, problems of systems biology, and also theoretical ecology together with the philosophers of biology that need to develop a philosophy of science that is very different from the philosophy of physics, and we've been a little bit shy about admitting that, but it's really just like that. And both ways of going about investigating the universe are totally okay, complementary, and really fascinating, as I found out today. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Could I ask 2 questions? One is about philosophy and one is biology. The philosophy question would be to try and join you. I am a self-declared reductionist in my overall outlook, but I think in philosophy and in physics you would find widespread acceptance of your saying it is the dynamical pattern that is stable over time that is real, what you call the local realism, and your denial of the myth of substance. And I think you find, for example, in Daniel Dennett's famous paper, Real Patterns, a good articulation, widely endorsed in philosophy, of the idea that not just in the special sciences, but everywhere, we articulate as what we call objects, things that have they're predictable enough to be worth mentioning and,
Right.
and indeed invaluable to mention.
Yeah.
But my biology comment was also to just ask, what about this tradition in the origin of life debate about don't think of life as self-reproducing automata, as in the famous von Neumann monograph, but think of life as metabolism. And what you said about, you know, the catalysis cycles and the metabolism reminded me of this Freeman Dyson book of, I don't know what happened in the origin of life debate.
Yeah.
It relates to other talks too, about whether, if you think of life as metabolism, you get a different fix on how it might have come about.
So I'll answer your last comment first. So I think this is a very good example where the machine metaphor becomes very stretched, right? So von Neumann's metaphor of a self-building machine becomes very stretched because organisms aren't machines, really, unless you really imagine machines like we don't have, really. And so I think this central concept of self-production is very special. It also breaks the software-hardware distinction. So computer metaphors are very problematic for this sort of thing. The mainstream of the origin of life field has moved on to something called the Rna World. Unfortunately, everyone believes that, you know, the secret to the origin of life is in some sort of chemical, and it's RNAs because they can self-catalyze. They don't really, but they need a network of reactions to self-catalyze. And this has distracted a bit from the ultimate problem. If you want to originate a cell, the main problem you need to solve is the integration of different processes into a coherent whole that self-produces. It's not what kind of molecules are capable of autocatalysis. More and more molecules turn out to be capable of some sort of self-catalysis. It's how to make the system keep on running. That is the main question. And there is at least a very vocal minority of people in the origin of life debate that are pushing this idea today. I think the machine metaphor is just problematic. So reductionism, I think without reductionism you just sit around and meditate. So this is more, so reduce when you can. So this is an argument against greedy reductionism or strong eliminative reductionism. Obviously, I'm a biologist, so I don't like that. Yeah.
One question, and then you have to go for the coffee break, or you can continue the discussion.
I'm surprised that, in fact, in your description, you make some connection with a very traditional concept in philosophy, the concept of form. And for example, as Jonas was in the tradition of Aristotelian tradition, and this is very interesting because it is form is defining some kind of organization.
Yeah.
What do you think about?
That's very dangerous territory because Aristotle has a lot of good ideas, but that they're mixed with very bad ideas at the same time. So I think, and also because he's so far away removed in his thinking about the world from us, it's problematic to put it. But of course, there are a lot of things that go back to Aristotelian notions. The worst of Aristotle's notions are types, archetypes. So this is explicitly against that sort of notion. But yes, so molecular biology for years now has neglected, and also evolutionary biology, the problem of form. How do you get from the genes to the diversity of form? What is evolving is not a gene, it is an organism. What has reproductive success or not is an organism, not a gene. And this step from the genes to the organism has been trivialized, although it's not solved at all. So this is what this is.
And I mean, just a question connecting to this. In fact, in order to explain the segmentation, you need more than, of course, genes. You need some boundary condition. If you use, for example, a Turing model, you have to put, in fact, physical or geometrical constraint.
I should have said, you need this little network and an embryo to make the pattern that you see. So, yes, of course, that was taken out.
But if you put the geometrical constraint, boundary condition, then you put something which is not connected with reductionism, but something which is connected with the form.
Right, and it is very important that the organism controls. So that's the main principle of Moreno's and Mossio's account that I really like, that the organism is creating its own boundary conditions, and those boundary conditions put it in a sort of a location in configuration space that allow it to continue going on. It keeps on keeping on, I guess. Yeah, and that's.
Isn't it similar to life of society?
So this is a huge question. Social insects societies can, to some extent, be like the organisms, but I think our society has a much weaker integration. There are some sort of signs of that organization there, but it's much less integrated. Of course, every one of us can survive for a while without the rest of us. Sometimes even, you know, that's an enjoyable thing. So it's a bit different. Maybe not the principles that differ so much, but the sort of strength of the integration of these interactions.
Thank you, Johannes. Yeah, we continue during coffee break.